Alara stood in the hall of the house her father had built, a space that no longer smelled of his pipe tobacco and sawdust, but of her uncle's cold pomade and the dry dust of neglect. She did not cry. She did not plead. She had learned from her father that some structures, once compromised, were best abandoned rather than salvaged. Her uncle, a man whose hands were soft from counting other people's money, slid a thin envelope across the polished surface of the dining table. It was the same table where her father had once unrolled blueprints, his broad, calloused finger tracing the elegant curve of an arch. "The house is sold," her uncle stated, not looking at her. His voice was a flat, administrative sound, like a file drawer closing. "The new owners take possession on Friday. This is a final settlement for your trouble." Inside the envelope were a few worn bills, a sum so paltry it was more insult than charity. It was the price of a cheap horse, or perhaps a month's rent in a town she did not know. It was the ledger's final, dismissive entry on the account of her life here. She was 22 years old, and her world had been reduced to the contents of a single, thin envelope. She took it. Arguing would be like reasoning with the rain. Her father had taught her that, too. Some forces in the world were simply weathering. You could either shield yourself or be worn away. Her legacy from him was not in this house, which her uncle had let fall into disrepair before selling it off like scrap. It was not in the bank accounts her uncle now controlled. Her father's true inheritance was in her hands, in her arms, in the quiet knowledge of how the world was put together. He had been a master stonemason and a builder of bridges, a man who believed that integrity was a physical property, something you could measure with a level and a line. From the time she was old enough to walk, she had been his shadow, his apprentice. He had not taught her sewing or baking. He had taught her how to read the grain in a piece of wood, how to dress a stone with an adze until it was true, how to calculate the stress load on a truss. She had learned the language of the physical world, the sigh of a well-seated timber, the groan of green wood under strain, the sharp, satisfying ring of a hammer striking a properly tempered nail. Her hands, unlike her uncle's, were not soft. They were mapped with the small, pale scars of a life spent learning. And from that life, she had one other object. It was her father's, and now it was hers. It was a plumb bob, solid brass, heavy and dense in her palm. It was old, its surface worn to a soft gleam, but the point was still perfect, a needle of absolute truth. Her father had called it his conscience. It always pointed to the center of the earth, a fixed and honest point in a shifting world. She went to her room, a small attic space that still held the faint scent of pine from the beams her father had set himself. She did not pack memories or mementos. She packed for work. Into a worn leather satchel went a small handsaw, a wood-handled chisel, a sharpening stone, a coil of good rope, and a tinderbox. She wrapped the brass plumb bob in an oilcloth and placed it at the very bottom, its weight a dense, comforting anchor. She put on her sturdiest boots, her canvas work coat, and slung the satchel over her shoulder. Her only other companion was Jasper, an old, gray mule with more sense and loyalty than any man she'd met since her father died. She led him from the stable, not looking back at the house. It was just a shell now, a place where ghosts used to live. She did not know where she was going, only that she was moving away from the soft, settled lands and toward the harsh, broken country in the west, the kind of country her father had loved. He always said that difficult terrain was honest. It made no promises it couldn't keep. She and Jasper walked for days, following old trade roads that dwindled into rutted tracks. The landscape grew steeper, the air thinner. The trees were wind-scoured pines that clung to granite cliffs. She slept in the open, with Jasper tethered nearby, his warm, steady breathing a comfort in the vast, silent dark. She ate sparingly, her small store of money dwindling with each purchase of oats for Jasper and dry bread for herself. In a dusty, wind-beaten town called Terminus, huddled in the shadow of a great mountain pass, she stopped for supplies. The town felt like an outpost at the end of the world. In the evening, Nursing a cup of weak tea in the corner of a noisy tavern, she listened to the conversations around her. It was the talk of miners, trappers, and freighters, practical men whose lives depended on reliable tools and solid ground. And then she heard a laugh, sharp and mocking. "They'll put the Folly up for auction again next week," a man with a wild red beard said, slapping the table. "County's tired of holding the deed. $10 they're asking. $10 for a pile of rocks and a ghost." Another man snorted. $10 is too much. Place is a death trap. The old bridge is gone. The tower's a ruin. The gorge'll swallow you whole if you step wrong. Alistair's curse, they call it. Her father had taught her to listen for the things people dismissed. Value, he'd said, often hid in the shadow of ridicule. She approached the men, her presence a quiet interruption in their loud talk. "This Folly," she said, her voice steady. "Where is it?" The red-bearded man looked her up and down, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "North of here, girl. A day's ride. Sits on the Black River Gorge. Can't miss it. It's the last great mistake before you hit the unforgiving parts." He called it the Toll-Keeper's Folly, a ruined stone watchtower and the broken abutments of a bridge that had collapsed generations ago, if it had ever been completed at all. The next morning, she went to the county clerk's office. The building smelled of stale paper and finality. The clerk was a thin, sallow man with ink-stained fingers, the same kind of man as her uncle, but with less money. When she asked about the property by the gorge, a slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "The Alistair Folly? You're not serious, miss." He leaned back in his chair. "It's $10 for the deed, and a lifetime of bad luck. The land is worthless. The gorge is impassable. The tower's a shell. No road goes there anymore." "I'll take it," Alara said. The clerk's smile widened into a grin. He clearly thought it was the best joke he'd heard all year. He drew up the papers with a theatrical flourish, his pen scratching across the parchment. She counted out the $10, a significant portion of what her uncle had given her. It felt less like a purchase and more like a wager against despair. The clerk took the money, his eyes gleaming. He stamped the deed with a heavy, satisfying thud and slid it across the counter to her. "Congratulations, miss," he said, his voice dripping with irony. "You are now the proud owner of a pile of rocks." She took the deed, folded it, and placed it in her satchel. She did not need his congratulations. She had the paper, and the paper was a claim. It was a place to make a stand. It took her and Jasper a full day to reach the gorge. The track was overgrown, little more than a deer trail in places. The air grew cooler, filled with the sound of rushing water, a low, constant roar that vibrated up through the soles of her boots. And then the trees opened up, and she saw it. The clerk had not exaggerated. He had, if anything, understated the ruin. The gorge was a violent slash in the earth, 100 feet deep, its granite walls sheer and unforgiving. At the bottom, the Black River churned, a furious ribbon of white water. On her side of the chasm stood the tower. It was a skeleton. The roof was gone, its massive timbers long since rotted away or fallen into the gorge. Whole sections of the upper walls had collapsed, leaving jagged holes that gaped at the sky. Below it, jutting out over the abyss, was the beginning of a bridge, a colossal stone abutment, and two immense, masterfully built piers that stood defiant in the middle of the river. But the span was gone. There was nothing but air between the pier and the far cliff. A cold wave of despair washed over her, so sharp and sudden it almost buckled her knees. The men in the tavern, the clerk, they were right. This was not a ruin, it was a grave. She had traded the last of her meager hope for a monument to failure. She slid from Jasper's back and walked to the edge of the gorge, the wind pulling at her coat. The scale of it was overwhelming, the sheer brute fact of its brokenness. For a long moment, she just stood there, the roar of the river filling her ears, feeling smaller and more alone than she had ever felt in her life. But then her father's voice echoed in her memory, calm and practical. First, find your shelter. Then, assess the foundation. She turned her back on the chasm and faced the tower. Despair was a luxury. Work was a necessity. She tethered Jasper in a small, sheltered clearing where a little grass grew and began her assessment. She walked the perimeter of the tower, her hand trailing along the stone. The upper levels were a lost cause for now, but the ground floor, despite the debris, was a fortress. The stones were massive, perfectly fitted, the mortar almost invisible. The man who had built this Alistair, had been no fool. He had been a master. His foundation was sound. The interior was choked with rubble, fallen timbers, and the accumulated decay of a century. But the four walls were solid, and a massive stone hearth dominated the back wall. This would be her shelter. She spent the rest of the day clearing a small corner, hauling out stones and rotted wood, her muscles aching with the strain. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the gorge, she had cleared a space large enough for her bedroll and a small fire. She lit the fire in the great hearth, its stones black with the soot of 1,000 long-dead fires. The flames pushed back the encroaching darkness and the profound chill of the stone. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. In the following days, she fell into a rhythm of methodical labor. She worked from dawn until dusk, clearing the ground floor of the tower. It was backbreaking work, hauling stone and earth, prying out the gnarled roots that had buckled the flagstones. Jasper, patient and steady, helped her drag the larger timbers away. With each stone she moved, she felt as though she were clearing away not just rubble, but the wreckage of her own past. The physical effort was cleansing. It left no room for grief or self-pity. There was only the weight of the stone, the ache in her back, the simple, honest reality of the task in front of her. It was during the third week, while clearing the last of the debris from around the base of the great hearth, that she found it. She was prying up a section of broken flagstones when she felt it, a faint, cool draft coming from the hearth itself, a place where no draft should be. The fireback was made of 3 enormous, fitted slabs of granite. But the draft was coming from below, near the floor. She knelt, running her hand along the massive hearthstone that formed the base. It was a single, colossal piece of granite, half the size of a cart. But as her fingers traced its edge, they found an almost imperceptible seam. The mortar line was different here, thinner, and the stone itself. She scraped away a century of soot and grime. It was a different type of granite, a darker, flecked variant than the stone used in the rest of the hearth. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She remembered her father showing her a hidden compartment he'd built into a fireplace for a wealthy client. The best secrets, he'd said, are hidden behind something you use every day, something people look at but never truly see. He had used a disguised keystone, a single, precisely weighted stone that, when pressure was applied in the right place, would pivot and release a lock. She pulled her father's brass plumb bob from her satchel. Its weight felt solid, reassuring. She examined the hearthstone again, this time with a builder's eye. She looked for tool marks, for any sign of a pivot point or a locking mechanism. Near the right corner, almost invisible against the rough-hewn surface, was a small, chiseled mark, no bigger than her thumbnail. It was the mark of a stonemason's hammer, a signature. Using the steel tip of her chisel as a lever, she pressed firmly into the tiny indentation. For a moment, nothing happened. The stone was immense, immovable. She put her shoulder into it, leveraging her weight. And then she heard it, a low, grinding sound of stone on stone, a sound that had not been heard in 100 years. The massive hearthstone groaned, and then slowly, ponderously, tilted inward, revealing a dark, rectangular opening in the floor. The air that rose from the opening was cool and dry, with the scent of deep earth and something else, something like old leather and cold metal. She lit a splinter of pine from her fire, its small flame a brave flicker against the profound blackness. She lowered it into the hole. A set of steep, narrow stone steps led down into the dark. Her breath caught in her throat. The clerk, the men in the tavern, they had been wrong. This was not a folly. It was a secret. Gripping her makeshift torch, she descended the steps. They were steep and perfectly cut, spiraling down into the foundation of the tower. After about 20 feet, they opened into a small, dry, barrel-vaulted cellar. The air was still and cold, and in the center of the cellar sat 3 heavy, iron-bound chests. They were not treasure chests from a storybook. They were thick, practical sea chests, built to withstand salt and water, covered in a fine layer of stone dust. Her hands trembled as she approached the first one. The lock had long since rusted through. She used her pry bar and the lid groaned open. She raised her torch. The flickering light fell upon a sight that made her gasp. The chest was filled to the brim with gold coins. They were not neatly stacked, but lay in a chaotic, glittering heap, glowing with a deep, buttery light. It was a fortune beyond her wildest imaginings, more money than her uncle had likely seen in his entire life of careful counting. She moved to the second chest, and then the third. They were the same. Gold. So much gold. It was overwhelming, unreal. She sat back on the cold stone floor, the torchlight dancing across the impossible wealth, her mind struggling to comprehend it. This was not just money. It was freedom. It was power. It was the means to rebuild not just the tower, but her entire life. But it was in the last, smallest chest, tucked away in a corner, that she found the true treasure. This one was not filled with gold. It contained a single object, a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover stamped with a simple, elegant compass rose. She carried it back up the steps into the firelight of her makeshift home and sat down on her bedroll. Her hands were still shaking as she opened the cover. The first page was written in a strong, clear hand, the ink faded but perfectly legible. I, Alistair Finch, Master Bridgewright, set this down in the year of our Lord, 1788. She read on, the roar of the river outside fading away as she was pulled into the story of the man who had built this place. Alistair's story was one of genius and betrayal. He had been a brilliant engineer, a visionary who had designed the great bridges of the eastern cities. But he had been betrayed by a partner, a man with a silver tongue and powerful friends, who had stolen his designs, claimed them as his own, and used false accusations of fraud to have Alistair ruined and exiled. He had retreated here, to this wild, impassable gorge, with what little money he had left. He had bought the land and begun his final, greatest work, a bridge and a tower that would be his testament, a structure built with an integrity his betrayer could never comprehend. He wrote of his solitude, of the companionship he found in the stone and the river. He wrote of the years spent quarrying the granite, of fitting the stones with a precision that was a form of prayer. The journal was filled with sketches, calculations, and detailed plans for the bridge. He had designed a revolutionary cantilevered structure, one that would leap across the gorge in a single, breathtaking span. But he had grown old, his strength failing before he could complete it. The last entries were filled with a quiet sadness, a resignation that his masterpiece would remain a ruin. And then, the final page. It was addressed not to a person, but to a spirit. To the one with true eyes and steady hands, it began. If you are reading this, then you have found my secret. You have seen the truth in the stone, and for that, the contents of this vault are yours. I have no heir but competence. I have no kin but a fellow builder. This fortune was ill-gotten by my betrayer, and recovered by my own hand. It is a weight I no longer wish to carry. But it is my hope that you will not simply take the gold and leave my work to crumble. This gorge is a division. This bridge was meant to be a connection. Finish the work. Let this not be a monument to my failure, but a testament to our shared craft. Build a life here. Find the peace in the stone that I sought. It is all yours. A blessing upon you, and upon this place." Alara closed the book, tears finally blurring her vision. They were not tears of grief or despair, but of a profound, aching gratitude. She was not alone. 100 years ago, a man she had never met, a man just like her father, had reached across time and seen her. He had understood her. He had left her not just a fortune, but a purpose, a legacy. She was no longer an outcast adrift in the world. She was the heir to Alistair Finch. She was the keeper of the tower and the builder of the bridge. That night, she did not sleep in her rough corner. She unrolled her bedroll in the center of the great room, by the warm hearth, in the heart of her home. The gold below was a tool, but the journal in her hands was the blueprint. The next morning, the world looked different. The ruin was no longer a symbol of failure. It was a canvas. The work ahead was monumental, but it was no longer impossible. It was necessary. She had the means, she had the knowledge, and now she had the purpose. She began. Her first task was the tower. A bridge was useless without a strong anchor. Using the gold for supplies, she began the slow, methodical process of restoration. She bought a new, stronger mule and a sturdy cart. She made trips to Terminus, a quiet, determined figure who paid in gold for sacks of lime, for good steel tools, for coils of thick rope and blocks and tackles. The store owner, a practical, no-nonsense woman named Marta, stopped looking at her with pity and started looking at her with a grudging respect. The men in the tavern stopped whispering about the mad girl and started whispering about the rich girl, though none of them were brave enough to approach the gorge. Alara worked. She built a small, efficient quarry in the cliffs behind the tower, learning to read the granite for its best seams, just as Alistair had. She used drills and wedges to split the rock, then dressed each stone by hand. She rebuilt the collapsed sections of the wall, one stone at a time, her mortar mixes perfect, her joints tight and true. She rigged a system of pulleys and levers, using jasper as her engine, to hoist the massive stones into place. It was a slow, deliberate ballet of physics and force. Months turned into a year. The walls of the tower rose, straight and strong. She found a stand of old-growth pine in a high valley, just where Alistair's journal had said it would be. She spent a winter felling the trees, squaring them into massive beams with her adze, the clean scent of pine resin sharp in the cold air. In the spring, she hauled them to the tower and began to construct the roof. Her solitary labor did not go entirely unnoticed. A grizzled old trapper named Silas, who roamed the high country, began to appear at the edge of her clearing from time to time. He never spoke much. He would watch her work for an hour, his eyes sharp and assessing, then nod and disappear back into the woods. One day she found a string of freshly caught trout left on a rock near her camp. Another time, a bundle of medicinal herbs. It was a conversation without words, a language of mutual respect for competence in a harsh land. One afternoon, a man rode up the track on a heavy draft horse. He was broad-shouldered and soot-stained, his hands like leather mallets. He introduced himself as Ronan, the blacksmith from Terminus. "Heard you were building," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at her. He looked at her work. His gaze swept over the new stonework, the tight seams, the true corners. He walked over to a beam she was shaping and ran his hand over the clean, scalloped marks of her adze. "Good work," he grunted. It was the highest form of praise. "Your tools must be worn to nubs." He looked at her then. "I can reforge them, give them a proper edge, and you'll need iron for the bridge. Straps, pins, tension rods. Alistair's plans call for them." Alara was stunned. "You know of his plans?" Ronan nodded. "My great-grandfather worked for him for a time. The stories were passed down. Most folks think it's just a ghost story. My family knows it's a work of engineering." He spat on the ground. "I'll draw up a quote. You have the coin, I have the forge. We'll do it right." It was not an offer of help. It was a business proposition between two professionals. It was the first brick of community laid upon her foundation of solitude. With Ronan forging the custom ironwork and Silas providing silent guidance on the ways of the mountain, Alara's work accelerated. Marta, in town, became her staunch advocate, shutting down dismissive gossip and ensuring the best supplies were always set aside for the bridge warden, a name that was beginning to stick. The tower was completed first. It stood 4 stories tall, its new roof tight, its windows glazed. A thin ribbon of smoke now rose constantly from its chimney, a sign of life in a place that had been dead for a century. Then she turned her full attention to the bridge. This was the great work. It was a problem of physics, engineering, and sheer, brute force. She rebuilt the main abutment on her side, anchoring it deep into the bedrock. Then, using a dizzying system of ropes and a small boat, she began work on the 2 great piers that stood in the river. It took her another 2 years. 2 years of working in the spray of the river, of calculating angles and stresses, of setting stone and iron with meticulous care. She was building Alistair's cantilever design, a structure that reached out from both sides, supporting itself as it grew. She built the wooden falsework, the temporary skeleton that would hold the stone arches until the keystones were set. Ronan delivered the iron tension bands, each one forged to her precise specifications. Silas showed her how to predict the river's moods, when it was safe to work and when she must retreat to the tower. One day, a hunting party from Terminus rode out, curious to see the progress they'd heard rumors of. Among them was the county clerk who had sold her the deed. He stopped his horse at the edge of the gorge, his mouth falling open. The tower stood whole and proud, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. And stretching out from it, nearly halfway across the chasm, was the impossible, elegant curve of a stone bridge. It was not a ruin. It was a resurrection. The clerk stared, his face a mask of disbelief and humiliation. He turned his horse and rode away without a word, the sound of his mockery from years ago finally silenced by the undeniable reality of her work. By the beginning of the 5th year, the bridge was nearly complete. The 2 cantilevered arms of stone and timber reached out, almost touching in the center of the gorge. All that remained was to set the central span, the final piece that would lock the entire structure together. But the mountain had its own timetable. That autumn, the winter came early, and with a savage fury. A storm, the likes of which Silas said he hadn't seen in 30 years, slammed into the region. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets for 3 days, turning the Black River from a churning artery into a raging brown torrent. The water level rose with terrifying speed, washing out the low-lying fords and the single rickety wooden bridge 10 miles downstream. Terminus and the small homesteads on the far side of the gorge were suddenly cut off, isolated and vulnerable. Word reached Alara via a frantic rider who had barely made it across the lower bridge before it was swept away. Several families, who had been visiting town from the eastern homesteads, were trapped. Their own homes were on the other side of the gorge, their supplies dwindling, with no way to cross the apocalyptic floodwaters. Alara looked at her bridge. The central span wasn't set. It was a raw, unfinished structure, with a treacherous gap of 20 feet still remaining in the middle. But the main arms were solid. They were anchored in the bedrock, a testament to her and Alistair's work. She made a decision. Working in the howling wind and driving rain, she and Ronan, who had ridden out to check on her, rigged a system. They stretched thick ropes across the central gap, lashing them to the iron pins set in the stonework. They laid heavy planks across the gap, creating a narrow, terrifyingly unstable footbridge. It was a desperate, dangerous solution, but it was the only one. As dusk fell, a small desperate group of people appeared on the far side of the gorge, led by the rider who had warned her. It was 3 families, including children, their faces pale with fear in the stormy twilight. They looked across the roaring chasm at the makeshift crossing with wide, terrified eyes. Alara went first. She tied a rope around her waist, anchored by Ronan and Jasper on the near side, and walked calmly across the slick planks, the river roaring beneath her. She moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knows every inch of the structure she stands on. Reaching the other side, she turned to the stranded families. "It will hold," she said, her voice clear and calm above the storm's fury. "One at a time, I will guide you." One by one, she led them across. She took the children in her own arms, their small bodies trembling, and carried them over the abyss. She guided the shaking hands of their parents, her calm presence a shield against their terror. It took hours. Finally, the last person was across, and they all huddled in the warm, dry safety of her tower, where a great fire roared in the hearth and a pot of stew simmered. They were safe. They were connected. The bridge, even unfinished, had done its work. The storm broke 2 days later. The floodwaters receded. The town of Terminus hailed Alara as a hero. The families she had saved looked at her with a reverence that went beyond gratitude. She was no longer the odd girl who bought a ruin. She was the bridge warden, the woman who had tamed the gorge. In the spring, with the help of Ronan and a dozen volunteers from the town, she finished the bridge. They hoisted the final timbers into place and set the last of the decking. When it was done, it was a thing of beauty, a seamless fusion of stone and wood that soared over the Black River. It was more than a bridge. It was a promise kept, a legacy fulfilled. 5 years to the day after she had bought the deed, Alara stood on her bridge, looking back at the tower. It was her home, a fortress of competence and peace. A small, thriving community was beginning to grow near the bridgehead, a waypoint for travelers and freighters. The town council of Terminus had formally contracted with her to maintain the bridge as the official crossing, and a small, fair toll was collected from all who passed. The money went to the bridge's upkeep and the well-being of the small community it now supported. Inside her study, on a desk made from a single slab of pine she had felled herself, her father's brass plumb bob sat next to Alistair's leather-bound journal. One was an inheritance of skill, the other an inheritance of purpose. Together they were the twin peers of her new life. She was no longer an outcast. She was a steward, a builder, a vital part of the land she had healed. The real inheritance her father had left her was not a house or money, but the knowledge in her hands and the resilience in her heart. The fortune Alistair had left was not the gold, but the purpose he had bestowed upon her. The $10 she had given to a mocking clerk for a pile of rocks had bought her a home, a community, and a reason to be. It was, without a single doubt, the best money she had ever spent.